The classroom door clicked shut behind Mrs. Rowan as she led the small girl down the hallway, her heart pounding with a mixture of concern and dread. Mia's tiny hand trembled in hers, and the teacher could feel the child's entire body tensing with each step they took away from the other students. Something was terribly wrong. Mrs. Rowan had suspected it for weeks now, watching the 7-year-old girl flinch at the slightest touch, avoid her seat as though it burned her, and withdraw into herself like a flower closing its petals against the cold. But nothing could have prepared her for what she was about to discover beneath that pristine school uniform. The nurse's office was empty, the afternoon sun streaming through the windows and casting long shadows across the examination table. Mrs. Rowan knelt down to Mia's level, her eyes searching the child's face for any sign of what lay hidden beneath the carefully arranged layers of clothing. "Sweetheart," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" Mia's dark eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head violently, backing away until her small frame pressed against the wall. "I can't," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I promised I wouldn't tell anyone. I promised." The teacher's stomach twisted into knots, but she forced herself to remain calm, to be the steady presence this frightened child so desperately needed. Before we dive deeper into this story, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy educational stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. 3 weeks earlier, Mia had arrived at Brookside Elementary on a Tuesday morning, her first day at the school coinciding with the start of November. Mrs. Rowan had been teaching second grade for 12 years, and she prided herself on her ability to read children, to understand their needs before they even voiced them. But Mia was different from the start. While other new students might cling to their parents or burst into tears at the classroom door, Mia simply stood there, silent and still, her small hands gripping the straps of her backpack so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her mother, or the woman Mrs. Rowan assumed was her mother, had dropped her off without a word, barely glancing at the teacher before hurrying back to the parking lot. There had been no introductions, no exchange of information, just a child left standing in the doorway like an unwanted package. "Class, this is Mia," Mrs. Rowan had announced that first morning, her voice bright and welcoming as she guided the girl to an empty desk near the window. "Let's all make her feel at home." 23 pairs of eyes turned to stare at the newcomer, and Mia's face flushed crimson as she slid into her seat. But almost immediately she stood back up, shifting her weight from foot to foot, her eyes darting around the room as though searching for an escape route. Mrs. Rowan had watched, puzzled, as the child remained standing even as she pulled out her notebook and pencil, even as the other students settled into their morning routine. "Mia, honey, you can sit down now," Mrs. Rowan had said gently, approaching the girl's desk. But Mia shook her head, her jaw set in stubborn determination. "I'd rather stand if that's okay," she whispered, her voice so quiet the teacher had to lean in to hear her. Something in the child's tone, a note of desperation or fear, made Mrs. Rowan nod and move on, deciding not to press the issue on her first day. Perhaps she was just nervous, the teacher thought. Perhaps she needed time to adjust. But as the morning wore on and Mia remained standing, occasionally shifting her weight or leaning against the desk, Mrs. Rowan's concern deepened. This wasn't normal first-day jitters. This was something else entirely. By lunchtime, the other children had begun to notice. "Why does she stand all the time?" asked Tommy Chen, a bright-eyed boy who sat in the front row. "Is something wrong with her chair?" Jessica Martinez, usually kind and welcoming to new students, wrinkled her nose. "She's weird," she whispered to her friend Sarah, loud enough for several nearby students to hear. "My mom says weird kids are trouble." Mrs. Rowan felt a flash of anger at the comment, but forced herself to address it calmly. Everyone is different, Jessica, and different doesn't mean weird or troublesome. Mia is still learning our classroom routines, just like you did when you first started here. But the damage was done. By the end of that first day, Mia had been labeled, set apart, marked as the strange girl who wouldn't sit down. The second day was worse. During morning attendance, another student accidentally bumped into Mia as they rushed to their desk, and the small girl let out a sharp gasp of pain that echoed through the suddenly silent classroom. Her face went pale, and she grabbed the edge of her desk to steady herself, her breathing coming in quick, shallow gasps. Mrs. Rowan was at her side in an instant, her hand hovering near the child's shoulder, but not quite touching. "Mia, are you hurt? Did he bump you hard?" The child shook her head frantically, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I'm fine," she choked out. "I'm fine. Please don't call anyone. I'm fine." But she wasn't fine. Mrs. Rowan could see that as clearly as she could see the fear in those dark, haunted eyes. Over the following days, Mrs. Rowan began to compile a mental list of concerning behaviors. Mia arrived each morning in the same pristine uniform, a white-collared shirt and navy blue jumper that looked freshly pressed, despite the child's obvious exhaustion. The girl's uniform was always meticulously arranged. The collar buttoned all the way up even on warm days, the jumper hanging loose around her small frame in a way that seemed intentional, as though designed to hide rather than fit. She never changed clothes for gym class, instead standing on the sidelines with a note excusing her from physical activity. The note was always different, always bearing a signature that looked rushed and shaky, always citing some vague ailment that prevented participation. Mrs. Rowan tried talking to Mia during lunch, pulling up a chair beside the girl who sat alone at the end of a table, picking at her food without really eating. "How are you settling in?" the teacher asked, keeping her tone light and conversational. Mia looked up briefly, her eyes meeting Mrs. Rowan's for just a fraction of a second before darting away. "Fine," she whispered, the same answer she gave to every question. "Making friends," Mrs. Rowan pressed gently. "Fine. Do you like your classes?" "Fine." It was like talking to a wall, except walls didn't tremble and walls didn't look like they might shatter at any moment. The school nurse, Mrs. Patterson, had been working at Brookside for nearly 20 years, and she prided herself on being able to spot a troubled child from a mile away. When Mrs. Rowan brought Mia to her office on the 5th day of school, citing concerns about the child's refusal to sit and her extreme reaction to being touched, Mrs. Patterson conducted a gentle examination. She checked Mia's vision, her hearing, her reflexes. She asked about headaches, stomach aches, any pain anywhere. But with Mia's clothing remaining firmly in place and the child's adamant refusal to remove even her sweater, there was little the nurse could observe beyond the obvious exhaustion and the dark circles under the girl's eyes. "She seems tired," Mrs. Patterson told Mrs. Rowan after Mia had been sent back to class. "Maybe not sleeping well at home, but I don't see any immediate medical concerns. Keep an eye on her, though. Something feels off." Something felt more than off. By the end of the second week, Mrs. Rowan had tried calling the emergency contact numbers listed on Mia's enrollment forms. The first number went straight to a disconnected message. The second rang endlessly without an answer or voicemail option. The third belonged to someone who claimed not to know anyone named Mia and hung up abruptly. The address listed on the forms existed, Mrs. Rowan confirmed that much through a quick internet search, but there was no indication of who lived there or how to reach them. It was as though Mia had materialized out of thin air, a ghost child with no past and no family willing to be contacted. "I don't like this," Mrs. Rowan told her colleague, Mr. Harrison, during their lunch break in the teacher's lounge. "This child is frightened of something, and I can't figure out what. She won't talk to me. won't talk to the other kids, won't participate in anything that requires physical movement. Mr. Harrison, a veteran teacher who'd seen his share of troubled students, frowned thoughtfully. "Have you noticed any bruising? Any signs of physical abuse?" Mrs. Rowan shook her head. "That's just it. I haven't seen anything because she keeps herself completely covered. Long sleeves even when it's warm, that jumper buttoned and arranged just so. She adjusts it constantly, making sure nothing shows." Mr. Harrison's expression darkened. "You need to push harder, Margaret. If something's happening to that child at home, we have a responsibility to find out." But pushing harder proved more difficult than Mrs. Rowan had anticipated. Mia had built walls around herself so high and so thick that every attempt to reach through them felt like battering against stone. The teacher tried different approaches, offering to let Mia help her after school with classroom tasks, suggesting they eat lunch together in a quieter space, even proposing that Mia might like to draw or write about what she was feeling instead of talking about it. Each offer was met with the same quiet refusal, the same whispered "no thank you," delivered in a voice that suggested acceptance would somehow break her. The other students had stopped trying to include Mia in their games and conversations. She'd become invisible to them, just another piece of classroom furniture they navigated around without thought. During recess, while the other children ran and played and shrieked with laughter on the playground, Mia stood alone near the building, her back pressed against the brick wall, her eyes tracking the movement around her like a wary animal watching for predators. Mrs. Rowan observed from her position near the door, her heart breaking a little more each day as she watched this child exist in a state of perpetual terror that no 7-year-old should ever have to experience. 3 weeks into the school year, everything changed. It was a Thursday afternoon, and the class was working on a math assignment involving colored blocks that they had to arrange in specific patterns. Mrs. Rowan had distributed the blocks and worksheets, and the children were engaged in the task, some working independently and others collaborating in small groups. Mia, as always, stood at her desk, reaching across the surface to move her blocks around. The teacher was helping another student when she heard it, a sound that made every adult in earshot freeze. A sharp, high-pitched cry of pain followed by absolute silence. Mrs. Rowan's head snapped up, and she saw Mia doubled over her desk, one hand clutching her side, the other pressed against her mouth as though trying to force the sound back in. The blocks she'd been reaching for lay scattered across the floor, and the child's face had gone chalk white, her eyes wide with panic. In 3 quick strides, Mrs. Rowan was beside her, but she was careful not to touch. Not yet. Not until she understood what had caused such agony. "Mia," she said softly, her voice steady despite the alarm bells ringing in her head. "What happened? Are you hurt?" The child's eyes met hers, and in that moment, Mrs. Rowan saw everything. The pain, yes, but also the fear. The desperate plea for help warring with the terrified need to stay silent. Mia's lips moved, forming words that barely made sound. "I'm okay, just stretched wrong. I'm okay." But the tears streaming down her face and the way she couldn't straighten up told a completely different story. Mrs. Rowan made a decision then, one she'd been building toward for weeks. "Class," she announced, her voice calm and authoritative, "please continue working on your patterns. I'm going to take Mia to get some water. We'll be right back." She didn't wait for responses, didn't give Mia a chance to protest. She simply placed a gentle hand on the child's shoulder, feeling her flinch at even that light touch, and guided her toward the door. Behind them, the classroom erupted into whispers, 23 children suddenly realizing that something serious was happening to the weird girl who never sat down. But Mrs. Rowan didn't care about the whispers or the disruption to her lesson plan. All she cared about was getting Mia somewhere private, somewhere safe, somewhere the child might finally trust her enough to reveal what was being hidden. They walked slowly down the hallway, Mia's steps small and careful, her breathing still shallow with pain. Mrs. Rowan kept up a stream of gentle conversation, talking about nothing in particular, just filling the silence with a calm, steady voice that she hoped might soothe some of the child's obvious distress. "I know you're scared," she said as they approached the nurse's office. "I know you think you can't tell me what's wrong, but Mia, sweetheart, I'm here to help you. That's my job. That's what teachers do. We protect our students." The nurse's office was empty again, Mrs. Patterson having stepped out for a meeting. Mrs. Rowan was grateful for the privacy, grateful that it would be just the two of them, no additional adults to overwhelm this already frightened child. She locked the door behind them. Not to trap Mia, but to ensure no one would interrupt what was about to happen. Then she pulled up 2 chairs, positioning them so they faced each other, and sat down, waiting for Mia to do the same. But of course the child remained standing, her arms wrapped tightly around her middle, her whole body radiating pain and fear. "Mia," Mrs. Rowan began, choosing her words carefully, "I need to tell you something. When a child is hurting, when a child is being hurt, it's never that child's fault. Never. Do you understand me?" Mia's eyes filled with fresh tears, and she shook her head violently. "I'm not being hurt," she whispered, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I just fell. I fall a lot. I'm clumsy. That's all. Please don't make this a big thing. Please." But even as she said it, even as she tried to maintain the lie, her body betrayed her. She swayed slightly, and when she moved to steady herself, she let out another small gasp of pain. Mrs. Rowan felt her own eyes burning with tears, but she blinked them back. She needed to be strong now, needed to be the adult this child could lean on. "I don't think you fell," she said gently. "I think something else is happening, and I think you're scared to tell anyone because someone told you not to. Am I right?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Mia's face crumpled and she began to cry in earnest, great gulping sobs that shook her small frame. "I can't tell," she choked out between sobs. "I can't. I promised. And if I tell, it'll be worse. It's always worse when I tell." The teacher's heart shattered into 1,000 pieces, but she kept her voice calm, kept her hands folded in her lap, even though every instinct screamed at her to reach out and hold this broken child. "Who told you that, Mia? Who said it would be worse?" But the girl just shook her head, pressing her lips together as though physical force could keep the truth from escaping. Mrs. Rowan tried a different approach. "Sweetheart, I can see that you're in pain. Real pain, not just from falling. Will you let me help you? Will you let me see what's hurting so badly?" Mia's eyes went wide with panic, and she backed toward the door. No, you can't. No one can see. I have to keep it covered. I have to." Her hands flew to her uniform, adjusting the collar, smoothing down the jumper, making sure every inch of skin remained hidden. Mrs. Rowan stood slowly, moving with deliberate care so as not to spook the child further. "Okay," she said softly. "Okay, we won't look right now. But Mia, I need you to understand something. If someone is hurting you, if someone is making you hide injuries and keep secrets, that's not okay. That's never okay. And it's not your fault. None of this is your fault." The words seemed to break something in Mia, some last desperate wall of defense she'd been clinging to. Her knees buckled and she sank to the floor, curling into herself as the sobs overtook her completely. Mrs. Rowan moved quickly then, kneeling beside the child, close but not touching, just being present in her pain. "Tell me," she whispered. "Please, Mia, tell me what's happening to you." And finally, in a voice so small it was almost lost beneath the sound of crying, Mia spoke the truth. "It hurts all the time," she whispered. "My back, my sides, everywhere." She wraps them so tight, and she says I have to keep them wrapped, or people will see. And if people see, they'll take me away. She says social services will put me somewhere terrible, somewhere worse than home, and I'll never see her again. She says I have to be brave, that this is what happens when I'm bad, when I don't listen, when I talk too much or make too much noise. She says it's my fault for being difficult, for costing too much, for existing. And I really try to be good, but I keep messing up. And then she gets angry, and then... Her voice broke completely, the words dissolving into incoherent sounds of anguish. Mrs. Rowan felt rage and heartbreak warring inside her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm, to be what Mia needed in this moment. Who does this to you, sweetheart? Who wraps your injuries and tells you these terrible lies? Mia looked up at her, tears streaming down her face, and whispered a name. My aunt. Aunt Carol. She's the only family I have left. My mom died last year and no one else wanted me, so I went to live with Aunt Carol. And at first it was okay, but then she started getting angry all the time, and she said I was too expensive, too much trouble. She said I needed to learn discipline, to toughen up. And when I cried or complained, she'd get madder and she'd... She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't say out loud what had been done to her. Mrs. Rowan's hands were shaking now, but she kept them clasped together, kept her voice steady. Mia, listen to me very carefully. What your aunt has been doing to you is called abuse. It's wrong, it's illegal, and it stops today, right now. Do you understand? You are not going to be sent somewhere terrible. You're going to be kept safe. But I need you to let me see your injuries. I need to document what's been done to you so we can make sure it never happens again. Mia stared at her for a long moment, fear and hope battling in those dark eyes. Then, slowly, trembling, she nodded. The teacher stood and helped Mia to her feet, guiding her toward the examination table. I'm going to be very gentle, she promised. And if anything hurts too much, you tell me right away and I'll stop. Okay? Another nod. Mrs. Rowan's hands shook as she reached for the buttons on Mia's collar, her mind racing with what she might find beneath the carefully arranged clothing. The first button came free, then the second, then the third. Mrs. Rowan worked slowly, giving Mia time to object if she needed to, but the child stood perfectly still, her eyes fixed on some point on the wall, as though she'd left her body entirely. When the shirt finally fell open, Mrs. Rowan had to swallow hard against the nausea that rose in her throat. Beneath the pristine white fabric, Mia's small torso was wrapped in layers of bandages, the kind you might use for a sprained ankle, but applied everywhere, crisscrossing her chest and back and sides in a pattern that looked almost systematic. The bandages were dirty, stained with what might have been old blood, and they were wrapped so tightly that Mrs. Rowan could see the flesh bulging slightly around the edges. Oh, sweetheart, she breathed, and despite her best efforts, tears spilled down her cheeks. Oh, Mia. She reached for the edge of one bandage, then paused. I'm going to unwrap these now, okay? I'll be as careful as I can. Mia nodded, still staring at the wall, her breathing shallow and quick. Mrs. Rowan began to unwind the first layer, her movements gentle but efficient. As she worked, she kept talking, filling the silence with reassurances and promises that this would all be over soon, that help was coming, that Mia was so brave for finally telling the truth. The bandages seemed to go on forever, layer after layer of dirty cloth that reeked of old sweat and fear. When Mrs. Rowan finally reached skin, she nearly cried out. Mia's back and sides were covered in bruises, deep purple and yellow and green marks that told a story of repeated trauma over weeks or possibly months. There were scratches too, some healed into scars, others more recent and angry red against the child's pale skin. Along her ribcage, Mrs. Rowan could see what looked like welts, raised lines that suggested something had been used to strike the child, something thin and flexible like a belt or a switch. "Mia," Mrs. Rowan said, her voice breaking, "how long has this been happening?" The girl finally looked at her, and her eyes were hollow, empty of everything except exhaustion. "Since August," she whispered. "Right after school started. Aunt Carol said the first day of school was when everything changed, when I became too much for her to handle. She said if I'd just been quiet, just stayed out of the way, she wouldn't have to discipline me. But I kept doing things wrong. I'd forget to make my bed exactly how she wanted, or I'd talk when she was trying to watch TV, or I'd eat too much at dinner. And every time I messed up, she'd get angrier. She started taking things out on me. First it was just yelling, then it was shoving, then it was hitting. And then, about 2 weeks before I started at this school, it got really bad." Mrs. Rowan had to set the bandages down and step back, pressing her hands against her face as she tried to process what she was hearing. 2 weeks before Mia started at Brookside. That meant the child had been suffering like this for her entire time at the school, hiding unimaginable pain behind a mask of quiet compliance. "What happened 2 weeks before?" the teacher asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Mia's voice dropped even lower, barely audible. "I broke a glass. It was an accident. I was washing dishes and it slipped, and it shattered in the sink. Aunt Carol heard the noise and she came running. She was furious. She grabbed me by my hair and dragged me to my room. She said I was careless, that I didn't appreciate anything she did for me, that I deserved to be punished. She had this belt, the one she keeps in her closet, and she—" The girl's voice broke, and she wrapped her arms around herself, her whole body shaking. "She hit me. Over and over. My back, my sides, my legs. I tried to get away, but she just kept hitting. And when she finally stopped, she told me to clean myself up and stop crying. She said if anyone at school asked about bruises, I was to say I fell down the stairs. But the next day, she saw how bad the marks were, and she got scared. She thought someone might notice. So she started wrapping me in bandages every morning, making them as tight as she could so nothing would show through my clothes." Mrs. Rowan felt her knees go weak, and she had to sit down before she fell. This was so much worse than she'd imagined. This wasn't just a case of occasional physical punishment that had gotten out of hand. This was deliberate, ongoing abuse, carefully hidden and maintained through fear and threats. She looked at Mia, really looked at her, and saw not just the physical injuries, but the psychological damage that had been done. This child had been systematically broken down, taught to believe she deserved pain, trained to hide her suffering and protect her abuser. "Mia," she said, her voice fierce despite the tears, "listen to me. Nothing you did, nothing you could ever do, would justify what your aunt has done to you. Breaking a glass is not a crime. Talking during TV shows is not a crime. Being a child who needs food and care and attention is not a crime. Your aunt lied to you. She hurt you because she wanted to, because she could, because she's a troubled person who should never have been trusted with a child's care. But that ends now, today, right now. You are never going back to that house. Do you hear me? Never." The child's eyes went wide with fresh panic. "But where will I go? She said no one else wants me. She said I'm too damaged, too difficult. Where will I go?" Mrs. Rowan wanted to wrap this broken child in her arms and promise her the world, but she knew she had to be careful, had to be honest about what would happen next. "First, we're going to get you medical attention. A real doctor needs to look at these injuries and make sure you're okay. Then, social services will find you a safe place to stay, somewhere your aunt can't reach you. It might be with a foster family, or it might be in a group home temporarily. I'm not going to lie to you, Mia. The next few weeks are going to be hard. There will be questions, lots of questions, and you'll have to tell your story over and over to different people. But you're strong. You survived this, and you can survive what comes next. and I'll be with you every step of the way. I promise." Mia stared at her for a long moment, and then, for the first time since Mrs. Rowan had met her, the child smiled. It was a tiny, fragile thing, barely more than a slight upturn at the corners of her mouth, but it was real. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for believing me." Mrs. Rowan couldn't hold back anymore. She reached out and very gently pulled Mia into a hug, being careful of her injuries, and the child melted into her arms, crying again, but this time with what sounded like relief. They stayed like that for several minutes, teacher and student holding each other while the world shifted around them. Then Mrs. Rowan gently pulled back and wiped Mia's tears with her sleeve. "Okay," she said, her voice stronger now, more determined. "Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to call the nurse and she's going to call an ambulance. They'll take you to the hospital where doctors can examine you properly and treat your injuries. While you're there, the police and Child Protective Services will be notified. They'll interview you, probably multiple times, and they'll investigate your aunt. You'll need to tell them everything you told me, show them everything you showed me. Can you do that?" Mia nodded, her jaw set with new determination. "I can do that," she said, and her voice was stronger than Mrs. Rowan had ever heard it. "I don't want her to hurt anyone else. If me telling my story can stop her, then I'll tell it as many times as I need to." The teacher felt a surge of pride for this incredibly brave child who'd endured so much and was still willing to fight. She picked up the phone on Mrs. Patterson's desk and dialed the nurse's extension. Within minutes, the office was full of adults, all moving with purposeful urgency. Mrs. Patterson arrived first, took one look at Mia's exposed back and sides, and immediately called 911. Principal Davidson was next, her usually stern face softening with compassion as she knelt beside Mia and promised her that the school would do everything in its power to keep her safe. The ambulance arrived within 15 minutes. Two paramedics who were gentle and professional as they assessed Mia's injuries and prepared to transport her to the hospital. Mrs. Rowan rode with her in the ambulance, holding the child's hand and continuing to offer reassurance as they sped through traffic toward the emergency room. At the hospital, everything became a blur of activity. Doctors and nurses swarmed around Mia, their faces grave as they photographed her injuries, took samples for evidence, and began the process of proper medical treatment. A detective arrived, a kind-faced woman named Sarah Chen, who specialized in child abuse cases. She asked if she could speak with Mia alone, and though the child's grip on Mrs. Rowan's hand tightened with fear, she nodded. The teacher stepped outside the room but stayed close, pacing the hallway as she waited. Her mind racing with everything that had happened and everything that still needed to happen. When Detective Chen emerged an hour later, her expression was grim. "That's one of the worst cases I've seen in my 15 years on this job," she told Mrs. Rowan quietly. "The systematic nature of it, the psychological manipulation, the duration of the abuse. This wasn't someone losing their temper once or twice. This was calculated torture of a child. We've already sent officers to pick up the aunt. She'll be charged with multiple counts of child abuse, false imprisonment, and endangering the welfare of a minor. With Mia's testimony and the physical evidence, we should have no problem securing a conviction." Mrs. Rowan nodded, feeling some of the tension leave her shoulders. "What happens to Mia now?" she asked. Detective Chen sighed. "She'll stay in the hospital for at least a few days while they treat her injuries and evaluate her mental state. Then she'll be placed in emergency foster care. We have some excellent families who specialize in trauma cases. She'll get therapy, both for the physical and psychological damage. It's going to be a long road, but kids are resilient. With proper support and care, Mia can heal from this." The teacher felt tears prick her eyes again. "Can I visit her, after she's placed?" Detective Chen smiled. "I think she'd like that very much. You're probably the first adult she's trusted in a long time." That bond is important. Keep it strong. Over the next 3 days, Mrs. Rowan visited Mia every afternoon after school, bringing books and small gifts, just sitting with her and talking about everything and nothing. The hospital had Mia in a pediatric unit with cheerful murals on the walls and toys in every room, trying to make the space less frightening for their young patients. The child's physical injuries were being treated aggressively with pain medication, antibiotics for several infections that had developed in the untreated wounds, and careful monitoring for any signs of internal damage. But it was the psychological assessment that revealed the true depth of Mia's trauma. The child psychologist assigned to her case, Dr. Rebecca Torres, explained it to Mrs. Rowan during one of her visits. Mia has been living in a state of constant fear and hypervigilance for months, the doctor said, her voice professional but compassionate. Her aunt didn't just hurt her physically, she systematically broke down Mia's sense of self-worth and safety. The child genuinely believed she deserved the abuse, that she was bad and needed to be punished. Undoing that kind of psychological damage takes time and specialized therapy. We're starting her on a treatment plan that includes trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, play therapy to help her process emotions she can't verbalize, and eventually, when she's ready, some group therapy with other abuse survivors. Mrs. Rowan listened, her heart breaking all over again for what this child had endured. "Will she be okay?" she asked, needing to hear someone say yes, even if they couldn't promise it. Dr. Torres gave her a small, sad smile. "Define okay. Will she ever forget what happened to her? No. Trauma like this leaves permanent scars, both visible and invisible. Will she struggle with trust and attachment for years? Possibly her whole life? Probably. But can she learn to live with what happened, to build a good life despite it? Absolutely. Children are remarkably resilient when given the right support. And Mia has something many abuse victims don't have. She has you, an adult who believed her, who took action, who shows up every day just to sit with her. That's huge. That's the foundation everything else is built on." The teacher nodded, committing herself silently to being that foundation for as long as Mia needed her. On the 4th day, Mia was discharged from the hospital into the care of an emergency foster family, the Hendersons, a couple in their 50s who'd been fostering children for over 20 years. Mrs. Rowan met them at the hospital, wanting to see where Mia would be staying, needing to assure herself that this child she'd come to care for so deeply would be safe. Linda Henderson was a soft-spoken woman with kind eyes and gentle hands, and her husband, Marcus, had the sort of calm, steady presence that put people at ease. They understood trauma, they explained to Mrs. Rowan. They'd fostered dozens of children who'd come from terrible situations. They knew how to be patient, how to give space while still providing structure, how to help a child feel safe again. Mia clung to Mrs. Rowan as they prepared to leave the hospital, her small body trembling. "Will I see you again?" she asked, her voice tiny with fear. The teacher knelt down and took both of the child's hands in hers. "Yes," she said firmly. "I'm going to visit you at the Hendersons' house. I'll come every week, maybe more if they say it's okay. And when you're ready, when you're feeling better, you can come back to school. Not to my class necessarily, since you missed so much, but somewhere at Brookside where we can see each other. You're not getting rid of me, Mia. Not now, not ever. I'm here for as long as you need me." The arrest of Carol Brennan made local news, though the reporters were careful not to use Mia's name or show her face, protecting her identity as a minor victim. The details that emerged during the investigation were even more disturbing than what Mia had initially revealed. Police discovered that Carol Brennan had a history of substance abuse and financial problems, debts that had mounted after she'd lost her job 6 months earlier. She'd taken in her niece not out of familial love, but because of the small monthly stipend provided by the state for kinship care. Investigators found evidence in the house that painted a horrifying picture. A closet in Mia's room that had been used as punishment, locking the child inside for hours when she displeased her aunt. A journal where Carol had documented what she called discipline sessions with cold clinical detail, and photographs on her phone that she'd apparently taken of Mia's injuries, though investigators couldn't determine why she'd kept such damning evidence. The neighbors, when interviewed, revealed another layer to the tragedy. Several of them had suspected something was wrong. Mrs. Kelly, who lived next door, told police she'd heard crying late at night, sounds that made her uneasy. Mr. Say Rodriguez, across the street, said he'd seen Carol dragging Mia roughly by the arm on several occasions and had considered calling someone but talked himself out of it, thinking it wasn't his place to interfere in family matters. A postal worker reported that he'd once seen Mia sitting on the porch with visible bruises on her arms, but when he'd asked if she was okay, the child had fled inside the house. All of these people had seen pieces of the puzzle, but none had acted decisively enough to stop the abuse. This revelation hit Mrs. Rowan particularly hard. During a conversation with Detective Chen, 2 weeks after Mia's rescue, she learned about the missed opportunities, the calls that were never made, the concerns that were dismissed or ignored. How many people saw and did nothing, she asked, her voice thick with anger and frustration. How long did she suffer because people decided it wasn't their problem? Detective Chen's expression was weary. Too many, and too long. It's a systemic failure that happens more often than you'd think. People don't want to get involved, don't want to make accusations that might be wrong, don't want to risk making things awkward with neighbors. But that's exactly why training programs exist, why mandatory reporting laws exist. The system only works if people actually use it. Mrs. Rowan learned that there was indeed a report that had been filed months ago, before Mia even came to Brookside. A teacher at Mia's previous school had noticed bruising and submitted a concern to Child Protective Services, but the report had somehow gotten lost in the shuffle of an understaffed, overworked system. A caseworker had been assigned to investigate, but had left the agency before completing the assessment. The case had been reassigned twice more, each time falling to the bottom of someone new's overwhelming caseload. By the time anyone thought to follow up, Mia had moved to a new school district, and the case had essentially been closed due to inability to locate the family. This bureaucratic nightmare became the catalyst for change. Mrs. Rowan, along with Principal Davidson and several other concerned educators, began pushing for reforms. They met with school board members, with local representatives, with anyone who would listen to their concerns about how a child could fall through so many cracks in a system designed to protect vulnerable children. They advocated for better tracking systems, for automatic case transfers when children change schools, for more funding to hire additional caseworkers who could actually manage their caseloads effectively. They pushed for mandatory training for all school staff, not just teachers, on recognizing signs of abuse and understanding the reporting process. The local media, which had initially covered Carol Brennan's arrest as just another crime story, became interested in the larger systemic issues the case revealed. A reporter named James Morrison from the city paper reached out to Mrs. Rowan for an interview. She agreed, speaking passionately about the need for change while being careful never to reveal identifying details about Mia. The resulting article, titled "How One Child's Suffering Exposed a System's Failure," ran on the front page and sparked community conversation about child welfare, mandatory reporting, and the responsibility everyone shares to protect vulnerable children. Meanwhile, Mia was slowly beginning to heal. The physical wounds responded to medical treatment, the infections cleared, the bruises faded from purple to yellow to nothing. But the psychological healing was slower, more complicated. In her twice-weekly therapy sessions with Dr. Torres, Mia worked through layers of trauma, learning to identify and express emotions she'd been forced to suppress for so long. The Hendersons provided a stable, loving environment where she could practice feeling safe, where no one yelled or hit or locked her in closets for minor infractions. Mrs. Rowan kept her promise, visiting every week without fail. Sometimes they would sit together and read, Mia curled up beside her on the Hendersons' comfortable couch with her favorite blanket. Other times they would draw or play simple games. Often they would just talk, Mrs. Rowan asking about Mia's week and really listening to the answers, showing the child that her thoughts and feelings mattered. During one visit about 6 weeks after the rescue, Mia asked a question that caught the teacher off guard. "Why did you keep pushing?" the girl asked, her voice curious but not accusatory. "I tried so hard to keep you from finding out. I said I was fine over and over. Why didn't you just believe me?" Mrs. Rowan considered her answer carefully, wanting to be honest but age-appropriate. "Because I'm a teacher, and before I'm anything else, I'm someone who cares about children. When I look at my students, I see potential and possibility and futures full of opportunity. And when I saw you, I saw a child who was hurting but trying so hard to hide it. Your words said you were fine, but everything else about you screamed that you weren't. And I couldn't just ignore that. I couldn't live with myself if I'd turned away and let you keep suffering when I could have helped." Mia was quiet for a long moment, processing this. Then she said something that made Mrs. Rowan's eyes fill with tears. "You saved my life. You know that, right? If you hadn't pushed, if you'd just let me keep saying I was fine, I don't know how much longer I could have survived. Aunt Carol was getting worse. The punishments were getting more frequent, more violent. I was starting to think maybe it would be better if I just didn't wake up one morning. But then you wouldn't let it go. And now I'm here and I'm safe. And sometimes I can actually imagine having a future. So thank you. Thank you for not giving up on me." The trial of Carol Brennan took place 4 months after Mia's rescue. The prosecution had built an overwhelming case with the physical evidence, Mia's testimony, statements from neighbors and the previous school's teacher, and expert testimony about the nature and extent of the abuse. Mia had to testify, something she'd been dreading for weeks. Mrs. Rowan sat in the courtroom, though not in Mia's line of sight as the lawyer had requested, wanting the child to focus on telling her truth without worrying about anyone's reactions. The teacher watched as this 8-year-old girl, still so small and fragile-looking despite months of proper nutrition and care, faced her abuser and spoke her truth with a courage that left the entire courtroom in awed silence. "She hurt me every day," Mia said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "She told me I deserved it, that I was bad, that no one else would ever want me. She made me believe that being hurt was normal, that it was my fault. But I know now that was a lie. I didn't deserve any of it. No child deserves to be hurt by the people who are supposed to protect them. And I hope that by telling what happened to me, maybe I can help protect other children from people like her." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Carol Brennan was sentenced to 15 years in prison with no possibility of early parole, the judge citing the systematic nature of the abuse and the defendant's complete lack of remorse as aggravating factors. As she was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, Carol turned to look at Mia one last time, her expression venomous. But Mia didn't flinch, didn't look away. She stared back at her aunt with her head held high, and Mrs. Rowan felt a fierce pride in how far this child had come from the terrified, broken girl she'd first encountered months ago. The weeks and months following the trial brought continued healing and gradual returns to normalcy. Mia was enrolled in a new school closer to the Hendersons' home, starting fresh where no one knew her story or saw her as that abused girl. She made friends slowly, cautiously, but she made them, She learned to trust again, bit by bit. The Hendersons, who had initially been an emergency placement, began the process of becoming Mia's permanent foster parents, with an eye toward eventual adoption if that's what everyone wanted when Mia was older and could participate in the decision. Mrs. Rowan continued to be a steady presence in Mia's life, their relationship evolving from teacher-student to something more like aunt-niece, or even, in some ways, the beginning of a chosen family bond. They celebrated Mia's 9th birthday together with the Hendersons, a small party with cake and presents, and the kind of simple, joyful normalcy that Mia had been denied for so long. The girl's smile, once so rare and fragile, came more easily now. She laughed sometimes, really laughed, a sound of pure delight that made everyone around her smile too. The systemic changes Mrs. Rowan and her colleagues had advocated for began to take effect. The school district implemented new mandatory training programs for all staff on recognizing and reporting abuse. They established better communication protocols with Child Protective Services and local law enforcement. They created a position for a dedicated social worker who would work across all the elementary schools in the district, providing an additional layer of support and oversight for at-risk students. The state legislature, prompted by media coverage and advocacy efforts, passed new legislation improving case tracking systems and funding for additional child welfare workers. One afternoon, about a year after Mia's rescue, Mrs. Rowan received a letter. It was from Mia, written in her careful third-grade handwriting on paper, decorated with hand-drawn flowers in the margins. "Dear Mrs. Rowan," it began, "I wanted to write to tell you about my life now. I'm doing really good in school. Math is still hard, but I'm getting better. I made a best friend named Sophie, and we play together every day at recess. The Hendersons are talking about maybe adopting me for real, and I think I want that. They make me feel safe and loved, and they never yell or hit even when I mess up. Dr. Torres says I'm making excellent progress in therapy, and I don't have as many nightmares anymore. I still think about what happened sometimes, and I still feel sad and scared when I remember. But I'm learning that those feelings don't have to control me. I'm learning that what happened to me doesn't define who I am or who I can become. And I'm learning that there are good people in the world who care about kids like me. People like you. I want to be like you when I grow up. I want to help kids who are hurting and scared. Maybe I'll be a teacher, or maybe a social worker, or maybe something else. But whatever I do, I want to make a difference the way you made a difference for me. Thank you for seeing me when I was invisible. Thank you for caring when I thought no one did. Thank you for saving me. Love, Mia." Mrs. Rowan read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face, before carefully folding it and placing it in a special box where she kept meaningful items from her teaching career. This letter, she knew, would be treasured forever, a reminder of why she'd chosen this profession, of what was possible when one person decided to act instead of looking away, of how one child's life could be transformed by simple persistence and genuine care. The story could have ended there, with Mia safe and healing, with her abuser in prison, with systems beginning to change. But life continued, and with it came new chapters. Mia did eventually get adopted by the Hendersons, a joyful ceremony where she stood between her new parents and officially became part of their family. She continued therapy and continued to heal, growing into a thoughtful, compassionate teenager who volunteered at youth crisis centers and spoke at school assemblies about abuse awareness. Mrs. Rowan attended her middle school graduation, her high school graduation, and eventually her college graduation, where Mia earned a degree in social work, fulfilling the promise she'd made in that letter so many years before. As for Mrs. Rowan, the experience changed her teaching forever. She became known as someone who truly saw her students, who never dismissed concerns, who created classroom environments where children felt safe enough to ask for help when they needed it. She trained other teachers, sharing Mia's story with permission as a powerful illustration of why vigilance and action mattered. She became an advocate and an activist, using her voice and her platform to push for continued improvements in child welfare systems. And she never forgot the lesson that one child, broken and hurting and desperately trying to hide her pain, had taught her about the absolute necessity of refusing to look away from suffering, no matter how well hidden it might be. The ending of this story isn't just about one child saved or one abuser punished. It's about ripples spreading outward, touching lives and changing systems in ways both large and small. It's about how one teacher's refusal to accept "I'm fine" at face value sparked changes that helped protect countless other children. It's about how Mia's courage in speaking her truth, despite her terror, gave other children the courage to speak theirs. It's about how a community, confronted with its own failures, chose to do better, to be better, to build better systems and better safety nets for its most vulnerable members. If you've stayed with us through this entire journey, we're grateful. This story isn't easy to hear, but it's important. Children like Mia are in classrooms and neighborhoods everywhere, suffering in silence, waiting for someone to notice, to care, to act. The signs are often subtle, the children often skilled at hiding their pain. But if we commit to truly seeing the children in our lives, to trusting our instincts when something feels wrong, to taking action even when it's uncomfortable or difficult, we can make a difference. We can save lives. We encourage you to share this video with others, not for views or likes, but because these stories need to be told and these lessons need to be learned. Drop a comment below about your thoughts on this story, on child welfare systems, on what we as a society can do better to protect vulnerable children. Subscribe to our channel for more educational content that tackles difficult but important topics. And most importantly, if you work with children in any capacity, or if you're simply a member of a community where children exist, commit today to being someone who notices, who cares, and who acts when action is needed. Thank you for watching, for listening, and for caring enough about children's welfare to spend 50 minutes hearing Mia's story. May we all be a little more like Mrs. Rowan, refusing to look away from suffering, persistent in seeking truth, and unwavering in our commitment to protecting those who cannot protect themselves.